Okay, well, let's make a start, if we can, to discuss the question, is character a virtue or a skill? I'm Kathryn Ecclestone. I'm the Professor of Education at the University of Birmingham, and the University of Birmingham College of Social Science sponsors this session, and so is the session's partner for this. The idea of how we build character, who should build character, and what character is part of a very old debate. That's one of the reasons why we've put it in the under the spotlight strand for the Battle of Ideas, which is revisiting things that appear to be old but are actually taking a new form in the current climate, and that's what we're going to be looking at broadly today. So why are we looking at character in 2012? The left-leaning think tank Demos has thrown its weight behind the idea that the early years are critical for building character and that parents are the primary character builders in society. The report this year by the Riots, Communities and Victims panel called on schools to build pupils' character. So there's been a resurgence of interest in character and how it is formed, suggesting that there's something of a crisis of character. And one of the things that we might want to look at more closely here is that the case? And if it's not the case, why do so many appear to think that it is? And character, if we look back through centuries of philosophy and political debate, has traditionally been seen as a matter of possessing virtues such as courage and wisdom. And when I was talking to a feminist colleague of mine about this session, she said, "Oh, for goodness sake, character is such an outdated idea. It's upper class. It's about male ideas of British stiff upper lip, repressing your emotions, holding fast in the face of adversity, and being resilient." So there's an easy caricature, I think, about character. But on the other side of the debate, we've got positive psychologists who often invoke Aristotle to define character as a set of capabilities or skills, such as resilience, optimism, stoicism, altruism, emotional literacy, emotional regulation, and empathy. In America, there are new character schools in the most deprived areas. One that I looked at has the slogan, "Work hard, be nice." A recent report in America links character to eliminating problem behaviour. Eton and other public schools such as Wellington, which is represented here today, see character as central to their values and purpose, but presumably they don't see it as about behaviour control, or maybe they do, and Ian might enlighten us about that. So there are questions there about, is character a set of capabilities or skills that can be taught, or is it an outcome of moral choices, life experience as a set of virtues? What can science tell us about character and how it might be shaped? Or does science take away a moral dimension to this debate by suggesting that it's no more than what some people call a moral workout, the equivalent to going and toning your muscles in the gym? So here, to forge our way through such a complex debate with stoicism, resilience and great fortitude, we do have a really great panel. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll speak in. The first is Kristján Kristjánsson, who's Professor of Character Education and Virtue Ethics at the University of Birmingham and Deputy Director of the new Jubilee Centre for Character and Values, which has just been set up by the American Templeton Foundation. And Kristján has written books and articles on moral philosophy, moral psychology, emotion theory, and moral education. Ian Morris has been a teacher in secondary schools since 2001. He conceived and runs the wellbeing programme at Wellington College, where he also teaches philosophy and religion. And Ian has published a book recently about the teaching of happiness and well-being in schools called Learning to Ride Elephants, and has forthcoming articles which will argue that well-being is the principal aim of education. And I found out when we were chatting in the green room that his book has been translated into Icelandic, which was something that Kristján initiated when he was a professor in Iceland. Ruth Gledhill is the religious correspondent for The Times, a journalism tutor at City University, and she's also worked on the Daily Mail, the Birmingham Post and the Mail. She regularly appears on Sky and the BBC, writes a column for the Church of England newspaper and contributes to the Tablet and the Jewish Chronicle. She said, one of the things she put on her website, she's a great user of social media. Angus Kenned is Head of External Relations for the Institute of Ideas and plays a key role in programming this amazing, but I think it's an amazing Battle of Ideas festival and its international satellite events. He writes for numerous publications with particular interest in the Holocaust, classics, culture and the arts, economics and moral philosophy. He is a member of the European Cultural Parliament and is convener of the Institute of Ideas annual summer school, the Academy. So, Kristján, would you like to start, please?
Dear Kathryn, dear co-panelists and members of the audience, May 16, 2012 saw the launch of the Jubilee Centre for Character and Values, a multi-million-pound institution generously funded by the John Templeton Foundation in the School of Education, University of Birmingham. By the end of September 2012, almost 20 full-time members of staff had been recruited into the centre. Of those 20, 11 will be exclusively or predominantly engaged in research. The research staff includes the present speaker, who was on September 1st, 2012, instated as the centre's Professor of Character Education and Virtue Ethics. The professed remit of the new centre is to make it into a major international hub of interdisciplinary research into character, virtue and virtue education, research with both theoretical and practical implications. The research team will, over the course of the first 3 years, be engaged in 3 large research projects dealing with A, the professional virtues of teachers, medical doctors and nurses, B, virtue education in UK schools, and C, conceptions of the nature and importance of gratitude in British society. Furthermore, the centre will act as an umbrella for 15 other research projects, some already underway, but all aim at the exploration and eventual promotion of good character and virtues nationally and internationally. It's worth stressing that beyond the academic aims of producing high-quality research work for dissemination in scholarly journals, the vision for the Jubilee Centre is not merely exploratory with regard to present attitudes to character and virtues, but also transformative to shape the future attitudes and behaviours of the British people, as it says, and if required, to transform them. I think it can be said without exaggeration that given its grandiose aims, sweeping compass, and sheer scale of funding and manpower, the Jubilee Centre constitutes the largest research exercise in character, virtue and virtue education ever undertaken. As could be expected, however, the launch of the centre immediately set the cat among the pigeons, provoking sceptical and irate responses in blogs and on social networking sites. The voices of scepticism and antipathy were not unexpected or difficult to identify. Indeed, they echoed all too familiar misgivings about the notions of character, virtue, and education in virtue, namely that these notions are unclear, redundant, old-fashioned, religious, paternalistic, anti-democratic, conservative, individualistic, relative, and situation-dependent. I hope that in today's debate I will have a chance to deflect some of those misgivings. The notions of virtue and character are, in my view, not essentially unclear. They have not been superseded by other personality constructs. They are not Victorian stiff upper lip residues. They can easily be couched in post-religious language. They do not give free rein to paternalism. They are not anti-democratic or anti-intellectual. They have no essential connection to the preservation of the status quo or to conservative agendas in politics. They are not about fixing kids without regard for social factors. They are neither relative to a particular moral theory nor the values of a particular culture, and they are not totally at the mercy of situation-dependent factors. I am sure, or almost sure, that some of those misgivings will crop up in today's debate, and that I will have a chance to respond to them in more detail. Let me not be misunderstood, however. I have been as critical as anyone in the past of attempts to dress up Aristotelian virtue ethics in fancy new psychological clothes. And I am not an old poacher cynically turned gamekeeper, just because I have started to work in the Jubilee Centre. The misgivings that remain as well-founded and have to be addressed by any new initiative to retrieve the conceptual triad of virtue character and virtue education have to do, A, with past experiences of doing so, which do not augur well for future ones, B, methodological problems about measuring character, and C, methodological problems about measuring impact of virtue educational programs. I hope I will have a chance to flesh out those misgivings in the debate also. I look forward to hearing what you, both in the panel and in the audience, have to say about all those, what for me at least are topical and exciting issues.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start by talking about incontinence. And by that, I mean when you know that you should do something, but you choose to do something entirely different. And I'll illustrate that with a personal example. When I was 17, I started smoking. And I knew deep in my heart of hearts that I didn't want to start smoking. I'd had a very, very good anti-smoking education. My father nearly died of a smoking-related illness when I was 14, and I was shown all the pictures of cancerous lungs and God knows what else when I was at school. Yet, when I was 17, my desires pulled me in a different direction. Two desires, principally. My friends, some of whom were smoking, and Laura Griffin. She smoked, and I fancied her, so I started smoking. I've often wondered why it was that I started to smoke, given that I knew that I didn't want to. And when I discovered the work of Aristotle when I was a bit older, and discovered his idea of incontinence, the penny dropped. When we teach character education at Wellington, the real inspiration behind that move was a man called Philip Zimbardo, who's a very famous psychologist. And he talks about all of us considering ourselves to be heroes in waiting, that we wait for that moment to make a heroic decision and act in a way that is in consonance with our values. And whilst we're heroes in waiting, we should consider ourselves heroes in training. And the character education program, which is part of our wellbeing program at Wellington, really draws on that idea from Philip Zimbardo. We get our young people to consider particular situations that they may find themselves in over the course of particularly their teenage years, where they may know that they should do one thing, but unfortunately choose to do something entirely different. And we use character strengths as a way of exploring that. There are some very, very good online surveys and tools as ways of young people finding out what their character strengths are. And what we do is we help them to understand what tools they have at their disposal to make good decisions, to help deliberate between their different desires. And that helps them to realize what they have, what they've got. And what we then do is ask them the question, well, you know what you've got, what do you want to build? And as we're told, character is developed through habit, through finding ourselves in particular situations, and over the course of many instances choosing to act in a particular way. The emphasis in these sessions is very much on developing good habits, and in fact, the wellbeing program as a whole provides an emphasis on developing good habits through reflection. It's not taught as such. We simply provide the young people with a space to reflect on what they've already got and what they need to build to make decent decisions in life. And we also recognise that there is a real need for situations here. It's no good sitting in a classroom, which is a nice, safe environment, and having conversations about making difficult decisions. Young people need to be placed in situations where their character will be tested, and they need to be given opportunities to reflect on that. And as Aristotle tells us, you don't become excellent by going to lectures on how to be excellent. So it's very much practical and based on real-life situations.
How many of us, when we read the Narnia books as children, realised they were Christian allegory dressed up as fantasy? I certainly didn't understand why or how this was the case, even though my clergyman father tried to explain it to me. And although I understood the difference between good and bad, and I understood why it was a good lesson to learn that failure was often necessary to learn the lessons needed for success, I didn't realise that this was something the Narnia books and Christianity had in common. In his latest work, A Lion's World into the Heart of Narnia, Rowan Williams begins with an epigraph from Francis Spufford, who wrote The Child That Books Built. He writes, "Whereof we cannot speak, therefore we must write children's books." And as John Gray pointed out in his New Statesman review, Spufford is himself referencing Wittgenstein, whereof one cannot speak, therefore one must be silent. This is the opportunity for me to explain that I'm not a psychologist, educationalist, nor theologian. So what I know in technical terms about child formation could probably fit on the end of a pin and still leave room for a multitude of dancing angels. I imagine I've been asked to speak here because of what I've learnt about character, particularly with regard to religion through my 25 years of work on the Times, and before that on the Mail and Birmingham Post, a career that actually began when I was little more than a child on the Uttoxeter Advertiser in Staffordshire. One of the most interesting fiction writers on the scene at the moment, in terms of the development of child character, is Michelle Magorian. Goodnight, Mr. Tom, the play based on her book of the same name, is about to succeed Blood Brothers at the Phoenix in the West End. The main character in that, William Beach, has an abusive mother who's a religious nutcase. We watch his character develop through trauma and relationship. But I want to recommend also her more recent book, Just Henry. This is full of wisdom, easily accessible to children, confused by the bewildering messages of today's secularized society. Although I grew up in the 1970s, I am the only 1970s girl I know who was humiliatingly rejected by a Radio 1 DJ when I threw myself at him. The environment in my 1970s was more akin to the 1950s childhood of my parents. C.S. Lewis, the Book of Common Prayer, and church twice on Sundays were the main influences. Although I tried my best to violate and escape these boundaries, including by throwing myself unsuccessfully at said Radio 1 DJ, in the end I couldn't. The moral influences of that time shaped my character then and still do to this day, and for that I am immensely grateful. Religion plays little part in Just Henry. Instead, he's a boy who has a strong character for a grandmother, a woman full of the prejudices of her time, mainly around the status of mothers who are married against those who are not, and women who are married to war heroes against those who are married to deserters. Henry absorbs and is formed by these influences, but he's able to observe the world around him and change his mind when circumstances demand it, and enjoy the rewards of doing so. Trying to look at the world today through the eyes of the young children I know, I see a world no less judgmental and damning than that of Henry's grandmother, but in other ways. Following the examples of too many of their parents, the great god money is worshipped, followed closely by the god celebrity. All this is underpinned by the terrible, deadly motivating drive of greed, apparently unstoppable greed. But left to themselves, in spite of all this, I observe that what children value above all else is friendship with their fellow children. Friendship and all the moral obligations it brings. Love, loyalty, duty, obligation. The moral underpinnings of a stable society. And this is a lesson that a child reading any of Michelle's books will learn without any help from religion. I believe that while C.S. Lewis drew inspiration for much of his best writing from his faith, the faith communities could learn a lot today from the writers of children's fiction. Graham Taylor, J.K. Rowling, Philip Pullman, Michael Morpurgo, to name just a few. Now, in particular, I want to refer to the question of character in the context of choosing the next Archbishop of Canterbury. The big issue that hangs over my area of work, epitomised in the Church's present crisis over the archiepiscopal succession, is whether one needs a Christian template through which to define character. What do we think of the character of Christ? I quote, "Christian children all must be mild, obedient, good as he." Could any appraisal such as this Victorian one have got it more wrong? Where did this come from? It came from us, from the requirement of children to conform in a particular epoch. In fact, Christ was uncontrollable, not mild, not obedient, and perhaps we and our children shouldn't be if we're to be as good as him. Obedient maybe, but not mild. once in Royal David City, is going to be on everyone's lips soon. As a baby, he was indeed little, weak and helpless. The whole Christian edifice is founded on the character of Christ and his absolute readiness to die for his beliefs. But this was not a meek death and not a mild death. So what place for a turbulent misfit in today's world? A quick trip to the doctors and a diagnosis of hyperactivity, no doubt. In the words Christ-like, we hear still those echoes of patience and forbearance. In fact, it means difficult, truculent, charismatic, determined. It is extremely inconvenient, but in my view, a travesty that we've mutated him into this figure of mildness and meekness, especially, I have to say, for boys. Figures such as Peter Tatchell are, in my view, more the thing. It is a bold thing to do, to attempt to arrest Robert Mugabe in Paris. But I can't imagine any parent, not even me, holding up Peter as a figure worthy of emulation, because his passion for justice has not made him rich. So where does character come from? And is the Christian example necessary or even desirable? Isn't it, from every point of view, better for a child to be meek, mild and obedient? There is so much to do on this that I really cannot do much more than touch the surface, especially in the short time available here. But I'll quote Archbishop Fulton Sheen, declared venerable in the June of this year. He wrote, "Education trains only half a man, developing his intellect but not his will, his mind but not his character. It gives him knowledge of facts, but no purpose or destiny. There's no final determinant of truth except power, which has already enslaved 1/3 of the world."
In terms of talking about a crisis of character, which is the way Kathryn was framing this at the beginning, I wonder, deliberately over-egging this, if it's not a crisis of character, just maybe an absence of characters today. Peter Tatchell is still around. Peter is no doubt a character and very worthy of emulation. That doesn't mean you have to be exactly like Peter, but you should be in the world to the same extent that Peter is, and that's a lesson we should have more of. I think Ruth is right. The turbulent misfits are more misfitting than ever, and I think there's a very real tendency for people to keep their heads down in today's culture of relative fear and need for conformity. I almost wonder if the amount that we talk about character today stands in an inverse relationship to the amount of real characters there are out there in the world. Maybe we talk about character because we lament its absence. You do see character used in other ways. If you can go onto a property website to search for a character home, they're always all the same. Or coming in on the train through South London, I saw an advert that said, "Character offices available on this South London estate," which is an oxymoron if I ever heard one. I think the process of becoming an adult, one's own character, a character in one's own story, if you like, a self-creation, is actually something that's very much out of fashion, simply because I think we're fearful of the unpredictable, unintended consequences when we act on the world, act out the narrative in our own plotline, and decide for ourselves what we might want to do. Instead, we value self-expression and a set of widely defined, sort of off-the-shelf psychological toolkits that we've heard mention of already. Psychological skills, resilience toolkits, emotional workouts, desire muscling, I guess. I mean, water wings for life is effectively what we're talking about here. And I think that it's actually a serious discussion, because the more and more we talk about the question of who you are, what is your character, when we talk about that in what is ostensibly a democracy, a government of the people, by the people, I think it's illegitimate for government to express an interest in the sort of person you are, because a democracy relies on self-government. Right? So I have to be myself in a democracy for it to be legitimate. And that means the question of who I am is one that it can only ever be given by myself. So to the extent that we do, and I think we do, see more and more interest by government, education in various ways in the question of who we are, and to quote Kristján, a heavily funded interest in transforming the way we are, our attitudes and behaviours, I think that runs directly counter to the fundamental principle of democracy, which is your own self-government. Your character, I think, I'm not an Aristotelian on this way, in this sense, is a result of the choices you've actually made in the world. The sum of those choices makes you a character in the story of your own life. In that sense, you self-author your own self. You write your own story. When government gets involved in writing the story for you, there's obviously a question about who decides what the right outcome should be, and why they would have any right to decide how you should think or how you should act. As I say, when it even goes so far as to nod at the idea, big society here, of compelling voluntary activity in the interests of society, I think there's a bit of a clue that something's going wrong. Compelled voluntary education is something that Michael Gove has suggested as part of his new ABACs. And like any of these character discussions, there is an immediate, huge question mark next to it. How do we measure the character of this compelled voluntary activity? And I think when we look around, the trappings, if you like, of this non-democratic, technocratic bureaucracy are there. Nudge units, family intervention squads, emotional training registers, happiness monitors, all, of course, like any good bureaucracy, necessarily obsessed with what can only be quantitative measures. The existential question of who you are doesn't lend itself to rulers or tick boxes. How could it? Instead, unable to answer that question from without, they try and measure your behaviours. And of course, what happens when you try and measure somebody's behaviour, your resilience, stoicism quotient, as it were, when you measure up against the scale, you are inevitably found wanting. That could only be the case. When you try and measure the amount of courage you have, you will find it's not enough. Partly that is because we are only human, right? But partly because the scrutiny, the you must conform to standard X, will always find you wanting. So I think even the very act of measuring is to reduce, however well-meaning it may be in schools, to offer such help is to increase the need for such help, because I think it is to objectify our weaknesses and our failures, and thereby, through attempting to increase our self-resilience, necessarily undermine our self-resilience. I mean, it's like teaching resilience in school has got to be the one cast-iron way of undermining people's resilience. You'll say, oh, hang on, am I not resilient enough? Could I do double resilience? Because I just want to be sure. I mean, it's as J.S. Mill pointed out, ask yourself if you are happy and you cease to be so. Ask yourself if you're brave and you'll be scared. To put it strongly, when that argument is developed, it does become a form of psychological determinism. It basically says that you're determined, yellow-carded already, determined by our nature and the possibility of transcending your human reality. It is to deny the possibility of being human in the sense that I mean it here, to create your own character and your own self. That's something that, to a large degree, is being argued that should be taken out of your hands and into the hands of experts with resilience rulers, fixing and determining your vulnerability and to the extent of it. And my last sort of exhortation, I suppose, on this, then, if we actually want a world with more characters in it, then the only way of doing that is to afford people more freedom. Teachers and parents, insofar as they have a role in showing children the path to establishing themselves in the world as a character, can only be to tell them that they have choices, they must make choices, and that those choices have consequences, and that by being who we are, being and becoming who we want to be, we can also build character in others.
So I think this is a question for Ian and Angus. I mean, I had a very moral education. I was brought up in a Catholic school until I was 18, and that is, you are, if you like it, it sounds a bit what you're describing, but I just wonder if it is, in the sense that you were faced with what would happen. Here's a good Samaritan. What happens if you see someone lying in the road? All the parables. I mean, you spent your time talking about that, and there obviously were real absolutes about no sex before marriage, not because you know, it's dangerous or whatever, because that's it. You don't do it, and you go to hell if you do, I guess. So in that sense, I just wonder, what moral dilemmas are you asking your children, and are they similar? So just be interested in that. And then to Angus, and I say, you know, is it just to say, well, you make your own choices? Because that what did seem to me a very strong moral education, which, you know, like Ruth is saying, has determined my path, whether I have gone for that or not, but seemed to be more than just saying, you know, let me just freewheel through life and make my own autonomous decisions.
This survival of virtue ethics is quite interesting. In a way, if we do think that individuals have become very kind of weak and passive in the face of all kinds of interventions, the idea that they might try and build themselves up to be more self-reliant and kind of stronger in the face of some of this seems to be, on the face of it, just a very good idea. I guess one sort of problem that comes up is around Ian's, how he introduced his programs. Now, I might be sort of, obviously I don't know the details of these programs, but one worry is that these sort of hypothetical encounters that you're talking about, they could be, I mean, it's all very well to entertain hypotheticals, but they can be, unless you're really faced by you know, a genuine dilemma, they can be a bit bloodless. And my experience of some of these kind of things at school a long time ago was exactly that they seemed rather bloodless encounters. But that would maybe then bring us back to Angus's, which, to paraphrase the last couple of his sentences, sounded very much like Jean-Paul Sartre's "You are three, therefore choose," which was always a very kind of blank and almost, you know, you can see how the young student, maybe Jean-Paul Sartre was right, but you can see how the young student would have been utterly puzzled by that as a response. So where are the resources to come from to build, you know, to build the individual, to build character? I think the traditional one, which is still a very good one, is actually literature. Literature has always been very powerful. And I think actually reading Jean-Paul Sartre's novels as a young person is much better than reading his philosophy, simply because you get the dilemmas which you find there are not bloodless. That's why people read them. They are full of blood, you know, and so that gives us a way in here, maybe. So that's more of a suggestion, really, that there's something for the traditional literary education here, which I think gives us something important.
Hi. When you look back at the philosophers over the last 2,000 years, most of them thought that virtue was one of the most important features of education. And in the 1999 Primary School Teacher's Handbook, there was a list of values which it said all of society could agree upon. We now seem to be very afraid of putting forward a set of values which we say we can all agree upon. And I wondered whether the panel thought there should now be a greater discussion about values and whether that should be considered in Michael Gove's consideration of the curriculum.
My concern would be with what kinds of subjectivities are we trying to create through character education. My research is looking at emotional well-being initiatives, and it seems that well-being is seen as being very much linked with our relationships with other people. And I kind of feel that we are trying to create an extrovert ideal. That we're trying to create certain kinds of students through character education. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Like the woman in the front, I also had a religious education by the dreaded Jesuits. And what was interesting is they knew exactly how they wanted you to behave. There were two aspects. One was how you behaved towards your fellow man and woman, who came into it occasionally, but also what you should believe. Now, I've given that up a long time ago. I gave up the belief, but I think the way you behave towards other people is absolutely vital. And that somehow got lost, and I suggest that actually in society we're in a state of total confusion, because historically the majority of people learnt that actually through the church. They learnt it through sermons, through going to church, through having Sunday schools being taught, and they also learnt it through their own community, where the community were involved in how people actually grew up, how they behaved, they were pleased, and okay, it could become oppressive, but essentially everyone was involved in creating the sort of person that they wanted you to become. Now, wanted you to become sounds pejorative, but I think Angus Kenned has got slightly confused between a character, he's a bit of a lad, you know, he's all right, Peter Tatchell or someone like that, he's an eccentric, and someone who simply is brought up with the attributes which enable them to live with their fellow human beings, how to behave, how to be honest, to be generous, to be kind, and all the virtues which enable human beings to get on together. And it's just sad that we're all, these days, we're totally confused. No one knows what it is. Is it well-being? Is it you being happy? Is it developing your own attributes? What is it? And ironically, the church and perhaps Ignatius Loyola knew exactly what it was, and so did the ancient philosophers.
First of all, my motivation for working on character and values is not my belief in something which we could call a crisis of character. Actually, I think my son's generation, he's 16, is much better adjusted socially and morally and much better behaved than my generation was. I'm more worried about the crisis of moral language. I think we are losing the language of character and virtues from our everyday language, and a recent word count of 2.5 million American novels published from 1901 to 2000 shows a marked decline in the use of virtue and character terms. And what has it been superseded with? I'm worried that it has been superseded with a kind of an instrumentalist, psychologicized language which empowers our thought about virtue and character. And I think an empowerment of language usually leads to an empowerment of thinking and behavior in the end. Concerning the paternalistic point, made by Angus, that it shouldn't be the role of government to tell us, what decisions we should take in life. Well, I think, that idea is in a way misplaced and betrays a certain psychological misapprehension about how character is acquired. There is no sort of education that children can be exposed to at school as an alternative to character education. Character education will always take place, because one of the few things that developmental psychologists agree about is that our character is formed through early childhood, through teenagehood. We cannot simply keep children's character as a blank slate in abeyance until they reach the age where they are able to take decisions about where they want to go in life. And thirdly, this is a point made by one member of the audience, is there any consensus about values in society? No, of course there is not. But I think there is a general consensus in the world about moral virtues, and one of the things which has come out of the vast funding that the positive psychologists have got in recent years, they have been able to send people all over the world, from Azerbaijan to Zimbabwe, to record the prevailing virtues, and they happen to be more or less the same wherever you go. This doesn't mean that there aren't, subtle nuances in the way people understand the virtues, like the virtue of honesty may not be understood in exactly the same way in two different societies. But then again, some people drive on the left side of the road and other people drive on the right side of the road, but it would be completely ludicrous to say that there is no such thing as the universal characters of a good driver. So I think, it is possible to deflect these challenges of relativism and paternalism it's possible to deflect them. The problem of what is happening to our moral language is a more kind of problematic one.
Respond to the question from the front about the hangover of a Catholic education. Certainly when we teach character at Wellington, we don't teach it as a set of absolutes or norms. We don't have the ideal Wellingtonian that all Wellington students should aspire to be. And when we present them with the kinds of dilemmas that they may well face, the people guiding those sessions certainly don't say to them, well, this is the outcome that we're looking for. What we try to do is engender a discussion around an issue that they're likely to face, such as being tempted to smoke, or being in a situation where there's too much alcohol and they might make a bad decision about whatever it may be. The obvious PSHE stuff, but also things like, when you're 18 and you've been at a boarding school for 5 years or 10 years, how do you leave the institution and carve out a sense of self? Well, what do you have at your disposal to help you to do that? Young people living in a consumer culture, how do you use character to help you to make wise choices about consumer messages? So what we're trying to do is put the young people into a discussion space where they're given a scenario And we're trying to make them aware of what they have at their disposal to help them to choose wisely. We don't control the outcomes, and you can't. It would be utterly without integrity, and as soon as you try doing that with a group of teenagers, the lesson's over, because the young people are iconoclastic and they're not interested in being controlled in that way. And the point about them being bloodless encounters, absolutely, I totally agree with you. So when we're constructing the sessions, we're acutely aware that for a discussion around a hypothetical to be engaging, it has to be, we have to make use of materials that they're used to, that they find interesting. So, at the risk of sounding like we dumb things down, the session we have on making choices about drug use, we use a clip from the In-Betweeners. It's a medium they're used to, it's engaging, it's funny, and there are all sorts of interesting messages in there about character. And it's a start point, it's a start of a conversation rather than the conclusion to it. So we try very, very hard to make these sessions as engaging as possible to avoid them being bloodless.
I certainly agree with the person who said that literature is an excellent route to moral education. And it is said, isn't it, that you should read so you can live many lives other than your own and learn from the mistakes that people make without having to make them yourself. And certainly reading is being encouraged by campaigns such as the Evening Standards campaign, as never before, perhaps. And maybe that will counter the other danger that one member of the audience warned of, which I agree with also, is the danger of extolling the extrovert character type above all others. Because it's well known from what I've read in sociological and psychological literature that of the personality types, people are probably born with their personality types. So it does become a danger if one type is seen to be superior above all the others. And I think reading, the emphasis on reading is perhaps one good way in which the tendency to extol the extrovert type is being countered. I would just quickly say at work in the Times we get a lot of young people on work experience. These are people just fresh out of childhood, starting newly into adulthood. And so we see at first hand the kind of raw materials of the product of their education before they've been much mediated by adult life. And recently I've noticed some very significant trends. A total inability to spell, and even from some of the top schools, a frightening lack of realisation of the necessity for fact-checking, and an incredible confidence. And I've also noticed that the people who are most confident are often the ones who can spell the worst. And I have noticed also people with very confident children saying, why can't my child get a job at a job interview? And I imagine, I don't know for sure, but I imagine the employers don't want these overconfident people. They probably want people aware of the Aristotelian thing that the unexamined life is a life not worth living. And I think a lack of confidence perhaps is needed now in our education to help generate character, virtue and moral skills.
I think we have to take a philosophical step back, if you like, because the reason I started with the idea of extrovert characters, if you like, was to put the thought in your mind of being a character in a novel. Now, they don't all have to wear different coloured hats and be extrovert in that sense. I'm trying to get across the idea that your character is a creation of yourself. It starts from within and it's part of your choosing. So the young student that went to see Jean-Paul Sartre, who said to him, you are free, therefore choose, had already chosen because he is free, which is why, interestingly, in his book, What is Literature, Sartre argues that the coward makes himself cowardly, already is, the hero makes himself heroic, and that there is always a possibility for the coward to give up cowardice and for the hero to stop being a hero. So the choice never goes away. I mean, it's not so different from Marx, is it? History and circumstances, not of your own choosing. The world doesn't allow you to freewheel through it. It's not a construct of your imagination in that sense. But the world does present its opportunities and limitations to you in relationship to the way you act on it, the projects that you bring to bear on the world. create a different world open to you. You start with X, you act on it, it's not X anymore. And in that sense, the moral education, I think, should start from what your projects are. And I think that can happen with children. When you say, Daddy, my project is to learn chess, or Daddy, my project is to learn how to flip these cards off the edge of the table and catch them, I think the parent can express a view on which of those projects is a better one. And that always happens. But it should happen from within. It's your projects that lead you to have desires on the world, to want you to change it, that then result in a set of behaviours that make that possible, and it feeds through. It's not the behaviours. The Aristotelian idea of sitting in a discussion space, habituating yourself to honour because you haven't had enough exposure to it, I don't really get. You become more honourable by doing honour projects. Sorry for the language. Finally and quickly, the need to, or the wish to recover lost values, the moral values of yesteryear that regulated our inter-behaviour. Again, take a step back. There's too much of a demand to say, let's regulate the way people behave to each other. Right? That will never work unless it is a self-expression of what you want the world to be like. That is itself universalizable. You say, these are my values. You invite, by the very proclamation of them, other people to share them. It has to come from within, because otherwise you're basically starting from an attitude, and this is so much the tenor of the times, that there's something wrong with all of you, and we're going to need, from here, this toolkit, psychology, a bit of religion, a bit of Aristotle, use that to regulate you. I don't think you have to reject that and start from within. That's the philosophical, at least logically, prior stage.
One of the huge frustrations about being a chair is you end up with 15 million questions of your own that you can't actually, you're not allowed to ask, and quite rightly so. I think the thing that Angus has touched on in the last bit, though, is a question about why are we now so obsessed with character again, and why is that enjoying a resurrection, and why is it taking a psychological therapeutic form? I mean, there's no doubt that the American Templeton Foundation is very, very interested in a psychological view of character, perhaps, as Angus says, because it seems to offer some sort of a bit of a toolkit. But the underlying question is there a crisis, and if so, or if not, why do we seem to think there is? And that's one that you may or may not want to come back to.
I want to talk about, well, I was caught between talk about myself or talk about talking about myself, and I sort of decided to do a little bit of both at the same time. Before I came out of the closet, I used to think that homosexuals were quite a sort of mysterious and exotic, and slightly sort of repellent group of people, mysterious and attractive at the same time. When I came out of the closet, which was sort of not long before it became a lot more normalised, I've started to notice more and more in the LGBT community, I'm sure it happens everywhere else, but I think quite in a high way amongst gay men in particular, is so many forums and groups that are getting gay people to tell their story. Come before a camera and tell us your experience, your life experience. And what has been quite startling and noticeable is over the years that this has been happening, how much those stories are converging. They are becoming exactly this, as if there's an unwritten script floating around in the air. People are invited. Show us yourself. Be who you are. Show the world so that we can all sort of share in your uniqueness. The more that happens, the more you just get exactly the same character reappearing over and over again. And to be honest, I'm absolutely bored and sick of it. I'm thinking of giving it up and going back in the closet.
I'm glad you've got that off your chest.
Don't do that. The difference is between telling your own story, which is self-emoting therapy, and writing your own story.
Science and the moral dilemmas and ethical issues raised by science are always on the agenda. I was wondering what members of the panel thought about the relationship that virtue and character has in relation to scientific progress, given that science is largely or broadly based on the premise of objectivity.
I just think we're talking about two different ideas of what character is on the panel here, and it strikes me that when you're talking about character and giving the examples of children, young people learning to say no, and that, in a way, that's what it sounds like. You're presenting a view of very vulnerable young people who need character in order to be able to say no and actually be quite compliant, which seems to be quite a different view to the view that Angus is promoting. So I wondered if you could clarify that. And I just wonder myself, is it possible to develop character for us, for young people to develop character, children at schools, when they're basically in a situation where it's seen as problematic to tell them that they've failed? And I think that's quite a thing that goes on in schools today around well-being, which strikes me as a, meaning that they can't develop character, or it's an impediment to that.
Yes, it's just a question to Kristján, because you were saying that character education will always take place, and that all societies have generated some kind of fairly fundamental universal values. And I presume that is true, but I wonder, without being overly pessimistic, how that can happen without there being a genuine intergenerational conversation, which relies on the idea that somehow adults know better than children. And in the present period, and I think this is evidenced in the fact that there is a preoccupation with children's characters, because although it sounds like we're talking about adults, we're actually really always having these conversations through what children are like, that we're actually in a situation at the moment where adults are so uncertain about what these values are in adult life, and adult society, that we are continually looking to children to generate those values for us. And so in that sense, if you have a reversal of that relationship, how can there be a generation of these kinds of virtues?
I wanted to say something about Kristján's point about the impoverishment of language, that we find less moral terms featuring in literature. I think that these moral terms may have been replaced with what you call instrumental language, the language of psychology. I would slightly be at odds with you with the idea that that is impoverished. Our understanding, actually, of psychological precepts as they relate to morality is far more acute than it was 100 years ago. We have a very subtle and specific sense of how it is that moral failings occur at the level of psychology and the level of our neurology. And so I would say, in that sense, the language is far richer if one seeks to understand it. I would say very quickly, this is a vast subject, there's no time to answer the question, but I would just say very quickly in that regard, as an illustration, Walter Mischel's study in the 1970s of children resisting marshmallows is one of the most striking findings in all of psychology. A 4-year-old's ability to resist the temptation of a marshmallow is a great delineator of their social connectedness, their impulse inhibition, the strength of their relationships, their ability not to end up an alcoholic, and so on. And so in that sense, we're looking at something very specific about the nature of us, our brains, our psychology. And I don't have the time ready to explain this, but I would propose meditation does wonders. And so I'm very glad that you're nodding, because that's something I'd love to hear you talk about if you've thought about it.
It's a question about children to you guys. I just want to invoke to everyone the book by Susan Cain, Quiet in a World That Can't Stop Talking. Wonderful book, by the way. Talks about the idea of children who are introverts at school, who are actually stigmatized at school by virtue of the fact that lots of activities and stuff about, good building personalities, taking care of themselves in classrooms, speaking up, being a team player, all those things are sort of contributing to people who actually aren't that loud, that extrovert. And to what extent do I think, do you guys agree with the Harvard programs, particularly, and Yale and the higher university, particularly in the US, where they try and push forward big players, the big team ideologies, psychologies, which are pretty much, shall we say, put forward from a very young age?
I strongly believe that character is something that's developed through experience. Having gone through an education without PHSE and all that stuff, or lessons in character, and come out the other end and survived, I think that's evidence of that. I think character is something that's developed through testing experiences, either because you're pushed into them, or because things happen to you. You come out of the other end, a stronger person for it. I'm very worried about this colonisation of the internal life of young people. My view is that character is about developing the resources that you gain through becoming more and more independent. So for young people, They're given greater independence. They make choices, sometimes they make mistakes, but through that experience of independence, that's how they develop their character.
Just on the neurobollocks point, put it that way, it's just irrelevant to this discussion. The question of the character you are, the moral values you display, the virtues you display, is an existential question, one of who you are, your insideness, if you like, but though it determines how you act on the outside world. But it's a question of human meaning. It's not susceptible to scientific measurement. So whatever the insights of neuroscience are, and I'm not denying those, they're not into the question of what sort of person are you. They can only be into the answers to the question, what kind of thing are you? And it's very much as we discussed during the earlier session. There's a subject, which is what we're talking about here. What is the nature of you as a moral subject? And there's an objective world. Science works on the former, philosophy works on the second. So that's just out of court. And that is why, and I'll finish on this, that is why every study that purports to show the benefits to society of behavioural training and transformation and nudging programs that will reduce costs to X and the NHS, smoking. No evidence for this stacks up whatsoever. Right? There are no reliable studies. Simply, there cannot be. Right? It's a category error to try and measure your moral worth.
Question about adults having moral certainty to impart to children I found very interesting. And prudence and conscience were always very traditionally paired, weren't they? And if prudence had been better paired in the modern era with conscience, maybe we'd have had a better outcome from the banking disasters. And then there's a certain former chief whip. And one wonders how he could have gone through his privileged life and education and apparently not learned the motto sapere aude, dare to be wise, not just of Manchester Grammar School, but even the entire Enlightenment. Now, my own Christian doctrinal beliefs are extremely liberal. Many people in the constituency I work with probably wouldn't count me as a Christian, so liberal are they. Nevertheless, I think that the Ten Commandments are excellent distilled observations of how societies work, and they're unarguably good and sound. And maybe it's that simple, and maybe what we need is a new enlightenment to come up with new commandments for a secular age, to help to give children certainty imparted by adults to guide them through the morass of difficulty that they're currently experiencing.
I'll pick up the first point about this idea of vulnerability. Nothing on our wellbeing programme is about teaching young people to learn to say no, because it doesn't work. It's a totally pointless exercise. What we're trying to get them to do is think about difficult situations they may find themselves in and reflect on how they might go about resolving those difficult situations. You talked about maybe an assumption on our part that all children are vulnerable. Well, of course, not all children are vulnerable. Some of them are. And the beauty of these sessions is they're not didactic. There's not a teacher standing at the front telling young people how to interpret X, Y, and Z. They're group discussion sessions where the young people learn from each other. So we very often find that a number of our students have been in these situations before. They've learned about them, and they can share ideas with each other. On the point about meditation and Walter Mischel, we actually recreate the Walter Mischel experiment in one of our wellbeing lessons using jelly babies instead of marshmallows. And it's a useful way of illustrating that what we're trying to encapsulate with this wellbeing programme is we are acutely aware, as the gentleman to the left here said, you cannot substitute for experience. That's the best form of learning, of course. And if you've got 24 children in a classroom, it's very, very difficult to engineer the kind of learning situation which is valuable for real life. Now, obviously, learning chemistry or French, ideal in the classroom, but if it's stuff about being human, it's very difficult to engineer those situations. But you can have a conversation, a meta-level conversation about the kind of ways we can go about dealing with the challenges we face as human beings. So we're trying to encapsulate both of that. So we have the meta-level discussion and getting the young people to reflect on their own experiences. And as regards meditation, I totally agree with you. Learning mindfulness is probably the best way of developing the kind of delayed gratification and all sorts of other. There's so many benefits of mindfulness meditation. There's a wonderful curriculum that's recently been developed for teaching mindfulness meditation to young people. And not just mindfulness meditation, exercise as well. I recently discovered long-distance running, and it's saved my life.
Problem about scientific objectivity. This is a big problem because most of the ideas about character education in contemporary times are based on virtue ethics, which is an objectivist moral theory about moral properties existing in the real world, just like redness or slipperiness or whatever. On the other hand, most of the social scientists still, I mean, the prevailing view in social science is still some sort of value relativism or subjectivism. And in order for programs in character education to work, you have to have philosophers and social scientists working together. And that's a tall order. The Templeton Foundation wants scientific evidence, and the problem there is that we don't have any tried and tested instruments to measure character or character change. The measures that are used nowadays, for example, by the positive psychologists, are simply self-report instruments. Children are asked, I mean, how do you rate yourself on a scale from 1 to 7 as being honest or compassionate or whatever. But those do not give us the objectivity that, I mean, we are craving for. Secondly, the point about moral education necessarily involving the relationship between parents and children or between generations. There's a positive thing to be said there and a negative thing. The positive thing is that repeated empirical studies seem to show that children nowadays and teenagers still count their parents and grandparents as the biggest role models. That hasn't changed over the last 100 years. It's not Lady Gaga, as you might think. The negative thing, on the other hand, is the thing which Ruth alluded to about some young people coming into the world with too high self-confidence, because I think our own inferiority as moral educators has led us in the last 20 years to try to inflate young people's self-esteem out of all proportion. And in 2003, there was a very famous meta-analysis published in Psychology showing that actually there is not a positive correlation between high self-esteem and pro-social factors. On the other hand, there is a strong correlation between high self-esteem and all kinds of negative things like, I mean, bullying, drug taking, taking risks, because too high self-esteem, too much self-confidence gives people a sense of invulnerability. And maybe that's one of the reasons for the banking crisis. I mean, there are too many people with too inflated ideas about themselves there. And finally, I agree with the question in the audience that psychology has provided us with a nuanced language to describe various personality constructs. Take, for example, the Big Five model of personality. But on the other hand, there are various things not captured by that model. And just to give you a very simple example, what is the thing that people are most eager to know about a potential spouse on dating websites? I'm talking about dating websites where people are actually looking for a long-term partner, not a one-night stand. It's honesty or dishonesty. And honesty or dishonesty is not one of the Big Five personality traits.
Okay. I'm hearing a lot about young people being overconfident. As a young person, I really do disagree with that because I really don't see that behaviour as confidence, and I really wish people would stop labelling it that. So when a child or young person comes up to you and is snapping their fingers and walking the right way and dressing and wants to be better than you, people always label that as overconfidence, but I don't see it that way. I really do see confidence as a state of living, as residing in oneself, being in oneself and being in one space and being comfortable with that. I really don't see confidence as something, if you come across someone who looks better than you or dresses better than you, you have to lord it over them. But we keep attaching that word confidence with that behaviour. And I would argue that young people need more confidence as opposed to, they need more self-esteem. Where there's big voids, there will be people who try to fill it. Lady Gaga's behaviour, for example, in my opinion, is really about filling a big void and then trying to fill that big void with big, outlandish behaviour. I don't think that's confidence. I would say young people need more confidence.
I'm a grumpy old man, I think, and I was going to say something rude, but perhaps you'll prompt me later. But there's certain things about me that I think I'm curious. I weigh and do the maths to find out how many units I drink a day, and I obey the speed limits, and I try and do things well according to some sports author saying if you want to win the Olympic Games, then you've got to clean your teeth well and do this, that and the other. Now then, I'm only telling you this because that's what I think I am. Now then, is there a Robbie Burns there who would say, God gives us the gift to see ourselves as others see us? Because my friends tell me something I know nothing about, so you need other people to tell you. So I don't think I can measure, I don't know what I'm like, but perhaps Robbie Burns or somebody else will tell me. I don't want you to tell me what I'm like, but you need other people to have a conversation with you. Now, whether it's kids or adults, but I think it's necessary over time.
I like the idea of freedom, but I think it's important to think in what context that we have that freedom. I think there is still a space for good moral template and good moral standard or ideal. The lack of it does not mean we have the ultra freedom or we are in a vacuum of moral templates. It just gives space for the alternatives which could be dangerous. The second point I want to make is I think it's important to humanize the education of good character, allowing people to make mistakes and don't have to carry the guilt or fear of I'm written off as a good character. And the last point I want to make is about external education learning, the interaction of it with meditation. If we feed ourselves with good ingredients, with good nutrients, meditation can be very empowering. And that's when a lot of the answer come from the inner selves. But that's good for us only when we feed ourselves with the good nutrients.
I've got a question to Kristján and Ian in relation to the lady's opinion about the confidence. And she said maybe we need a moderate confidence, say, for instance, in order to get a good job. But as far as I'm aware, in America, the more confidence you have, the more opportunities you get. Whereas in Japan, the less confidence you have, the more opportunities you get, because we tend to appreciate humbleness rather than confidence. So given that the world has become marginalized, multicultural, and a lot of employees are going on international business trips, do you really think it's realistic to work towards one particular universally preferable figure of a beautiful character, whatever?
A couple of people have identified, I think, virtue theory and religion and religious support for virtue theory. I'd just like to put a little counter from a Catholic point of view, Catholic literary point of view. If you think of the novels of Graham Greene or Evelyn Waugh or Flannery O'Connor or Shusaku Endo or any of the great 20th century Catholic novels, they are not about strength of character. They are about failures of character, almost universally. And it's about meaning somehow within failure of character. And also a quick question for Angus. I'm not sure whether you're confusing the wish to promote or cultivate virtue with an attempt to assess it, because I agree that there's real problems with assessment, but I don't think that education needs to be about assessment, and I think you can have. I was involved with the validation committee and you had to have a curriculum map, and for all your objectives you had to have them taught and practiced and assessed, and we said we wanted to have objectives which were not assessed, and we had to fight very hard to get it through the validation panel, but we did because it was a philosophy degree, and we wished to encourage a cultivation of a love of wisdom which we did not wish to assess.
I just wanted to reflect a little bit on, there's a phrase that you used to hear a lot and you don't hear much now, is character building. And actually character building, things we describe as character building are things that are hard to do, things that challenge us. And I think they're associated with a particular idea of character, and it has been alluded to, that idea. There are particular things associated with a person of character: integrity, fortitude, bravery, a willingness to act, those sorts of things. Things to do with subjectivity. A lot of those are now seen as masculine values and are seen as problematic. But I think that's all part of this story, and that's actually why I came to this session, because I think that's interesting. The way in which character is talked about today isn't in those terms. It's in a sort of much more amorphous, rather meaningless term.
I found myself sort of taking part on the fringes of the discussions that followed the riots. And I was rather shocked that as they came towards the end of their process, I was invited to take part in a roundtable discussion on what was obviously considered to be a sort of ultimate consideration, which was the consideration of resilience. And I found this very interesting because resilience actually means bounciness. And some of the most resilient people I've ever met have been sort of gangsters and people like that. They're very, very resilient. And the idea that you could substitute perhaps the word resilience for perhaps the word character, perhaps that's what they were thinking of. But I thought it was an interesting substitution of terminology, if you like. And going back to what Chris was saying about language and how language is manipulated and so on, I regard this with great concern. And I think this resilience idea, in fact, probably influenced the very morally neutral report that was produced by the panel that were appointed to consider the issues, which I think are moral issues of the riots.
When I examine myself, I see quite a disparity between what I would say my priorities are, or what I would like my priorities to be, and what they actually are as expressed in my decision-making. I think that is a result of my character. I think my decision-making comes out of my character. But I don't think I was around, or at least I wasn't interested, when my character was actually being built. So now that I'm interested in who I am, actually, like, there's a bit of a difference, and I've got some work to do. I'll be the first to say it. But the point is, the people who were around and invested when my character was being built were most likely my parents, grandparents, as people have said before. And so, as you look to the fact that actually those role models in a lot of young people's lives are less present than they were when I was a young person, where does that responsibility now lie? Because I don't believe that I have built my character thus far. By the time I'm 50, maybe that would be different. Maybe I'll have had a chance to impact. But now, as 23, my character was given to me, I think, by my parents. So I think that in light of people's lack of parents, I think there needs to be something thought about where that should come from.
Okay, so just to end then, before I come back to the panel, I mean, that's an interesting point that one of the things we haven't touched on, because we've tended to take quite a universal approach to this, is the government is very concerned about particular children's character, and as you've just said, about children who don't have role models. So, you know, the idea then that schools or other agencies like Sure Start, although that's now gone, should step in. I think that's an interesting question about particular children. But the other one that I think came up as well is about the buzzword of resilience. That is an absolute buzzword at the moment in policy circles all around the world. And it is, as you've just said, elided with character. But I think the other thing that's been happening in this debate is that we've elided, and I think Ian's been doing this, well-being and character. And actually, in policy terms, well-being has come from a completely different set of concerns about mental health, not about character. So we are eliding a lot of things in this discussion, which perhaps is inevitable. I think the other question came about, which is maybe to reflect on, is about national characteristics. I was in a session yesterday about culture wars, and we talked about the Irish character. Somebody talked about, the idea of the British character, the stiff upper lip. I was going to ask Kristján if there's such a thing in this Icelandic character. Is there such a thing as national character, and where do these sort of various things fit in to the idea of national character building? So far too many things to go at as we finish. I'd just say that at the age of 56 and a half, I have not a clue what my character is like. I know bits about my personality. I know bits about my strengths and weaknesses. I've never thought about character, actually, until I produced this session. Well, that's not strictly true, but I think the idea that we think of our character is very interesting. As an introspective sort of therapeutic idea, I find it quite intriguing that we're being asked to think about our own characters.
So I think character is a matter of what you do in the world. So the gentleman who at the front who commented on overconfidence and said, don't label me. Well, I demand the right to label you and judge you, actually, because if you do sit next to me snapping your fingers and listening to your headphone music too loud and characterize that as being in oneself as a good thing, I think that you're missing the fact that what we're really talking about here is being in the world, right? So there isn't a sort of solipsistic, navel-gazing view of character that should be encouraged. So in that sense, I take very great exception to the view of education that Ian's putting forward, which is teaching should be non-didactic. Now, I think the clue should be in the word. Teaching, of course, should be didactic. Teachers should stand in front of pupils and tell them stuff, content, history, stories. They should not encourage discussion circles, hold hands, Zen mantras, and learn from each other. They're students. They haven't got anything to tell each other by definition. Right? They need teachers to tell them what to do. That's about education, right? Quite simply. And the abandonment of that is an evasion of moral responsibility for the next generation by the adult generation on a quite world historic scale. Never actually been tried before, so we can hold our hands and see what the results of that are going to be. You make what you make of yourself in the world. And again, I would just stress, it's not a question of my freedom versus your morals. Right? That's just the wrong way to look at it. What I am arguing is that the values that we have, our morals, rely on, are predicated upon our freedom. Right? We choose to act in certain ways in the world, follow certain projects, and other people will come with us. Some will be against us. Sometimes we won't agree on our values. But it's only by acting in the world that relies your freedom. It's not at the expense of other people. And that's, I suppose, maybe fundamentally what's going wrong here. The idea of the moral regulation, the behavior control of society, sees individual subjective freedom as its enemy. Right? We're something to be neutralized through behavior control because we are potential weapons. Will smoke and cost the NHS a lot of money. You know these stories. What it ignores is our underpinning autonomy and self-government, which makes living together, being in the world together, possible, necessary, and worthwhile.
So what creates character? Experience strengthens it, but is character born? The interesting question regarding the relationship of character to science was raised. My mother always said to choose a man based on his character, because that would be a big factor in the character of our children, and so it has proved. Character building. Public schools of the past, such as Rugby, set out deliberately to build character for those men destined to run the empire, Freudian slip there. It worked for many, but God help, because no one else did, the casualties of that system. One of them was my own father. The art of seeing us as others see us, the consequences of mistakes, the lack of moral template, combined with the breakdown of excessive obeisance, have led to fiddling MPs, hacking journalists, riven churches, mendacious police, child-abusing celebrities, I won't mention banking again to the tweeter out there, and their exposure by the press as never before. Even celebrity, which by its nature seemed untouchable, is being subjected now to scrutiny. It looks as though everything is corrupt and all motives are venal. One of my great regrets about the abuse scandals in the churches is that I fear this has compromised their necessary role as moral teachers, and that it has damaged the tools the churches and other faiths can offer to build character.
I suppose I would beg forgiveness for eliding character with well-being, if it came across that way. I certainly didn't intend it to. But by well-being, what I'm talking about is the idea of human flourishing, achieving potential, living life as fully as you can, and character is something that contributes to that, along with various other bits and pieces. To address the question from the Japanese lady about self-esteem, I think there's a rearguard action happening in education now to try and undo all the damage done by the self-esteem movement of the 1980s, 1990s, and try and instead focus on self-efficacy, which is helping young people to develop the belief that they are able to do something based on real-world achievements, rather than a false, inflated sense of being confident. I suppose what I'd finish with is the idea of character building and the 23-year-old's question about, you spoke very much about having had your character built as if it was a finished work. And I think one of the things that we're very keen to emphasise with our students at Wellington is that character is a work in progress right up until the moment of death, and that it certainly should never be seen as a finished product.
Thank you. And finally, but not least, Kristján.
Thank you. Just quick responses to the two gentlemen sitting side by side. I didn't want to discredit self-confidence, but I believe in realistic or morally justified self-confidence. When my son was 3, we spent a few months in the States, and he went to a kindergarten there, and the first thing he learned was a song. Nobody has sung a song yet, so I will be the first one. And the song went like this: I am perfect, I am perfect, so are you, so are you. This is self-confidence training gone haywire. Secondly, I agree with the other gentleman that, I mean, the best way to know ourselves is maybe not to engage in some self-work or internal gaze, but rather to ask our friends, family, etc. This is called triangulation in technical jargon. But the problem is that, I mean, even if I think I am a duck, even if I walk like a duck, talk like a duck, and all my friends and family think I'm a duck, this doesn't make me a duck. So we might all be wrong. And the problem is we don't have the measure to prove whether we are or are not. Is there such a thing as global virtue, and do we need such a thing as global virtue? Yes, I think there is such a thing, and I think most research shows that individual differences, they outweigh national differences. I think the idea of a national characteristic is mainly a stereotype or caricature. Finally, my golden sentence is this: I think there is a kind of a misunderstanding or a misconception in the very title of this session, virtues or skills. I think virtues are a certain kind of skills, the skills we need to live well, and we shouldn't allow the competence technicians and instrumentalists to monopolize the notion of a skill. Thank you.